Hello, everybody, and welcome to my Guilds of Ravnica Dimir guild guide. Today we are going to be looking at the blue-black color combination and evaluating it for Guilds of Ravnica Limited, mostly focusing on draft, though keep in mind that many of the evaluations will still apply for sealed. Before I begin, though, I would like to remind you that I am continuing to make these videos if they get the support, because there are lots of things, other types of videos I could be making. So if you want to see more Guilds of Ravnica guild guides, be sure to click that thumbs up button, and I will make another Guilds of Ravnica guild guide if this video receives 40 thumbs up. As an additional bonus, because the last one was so popular, if this video gets 80 thumbs up before midnight on the night of its posting, I will make the next Guilds of Ravnica guild guide the very next day. So that's just an added incentive for after the video gets past 40 thumbs up. But without further ado, let's jump into the mysteries of Dimir. Okie doke, so now that we've started, what does the Dimir guild do? The three things it does is it slows the game down, it generates card advantage, and then it wins the games with flyers or bombs. Of those three things, the most important ones are slowing the game down and generating card advantage. After that, you can pretty much win with whatever you want. It's just slowing the game down is pretty much the most essential thing to do. And then after that, you generate your card advantage. Just naturally, the cards have a lot of card advantage built in, and then you win with flyers or bombs. The reason flyers are really good is because a lot of the time with the Dimir deck, you can stall the ground, which means your opponent is also going to have a lot of ground creatures. And then blue-black naturally has a lot of flyers in this set that can get through in the air. And Dimir also has some pretty good ones that are specific to the Dimir guild. But one note about card advantage, card advantage includes raw card draw. Making the opponent discard 2 cards for 1 card would also be card advantage. If you play a creature that also makes the opponent discard a card, or you play a creature that makes you draw a card, that's card advantage because you're getting a creature and a card from their hand. So all of those count as card advantage. And then the surveil mechanic is kind of like card advantage, especially if it's repeatable. It's just pretty effective at generating, getting you better draws in the game. So I'm going to count that to some degree as a little bit of card advantage. Before I go any further, I do want to say that Dimir has a bit of a stereotype that it's more of a control deck. I mean, you hear of control decks, a lot of the time you think lots of spells, lots of removal effects. But I do want to emphasize especially that in the Dimir guild, in this iteration, a lot of the best cards are creatures. And the reason for this is that creatures serve as blockers. There are a lot of creatures in this set that are card advantage engines, and then you're going to be winning the game with creatures almost every single time. So I do want to emphasize that you're going to be using creatures, and to further emphasize that, I'm going to be dividing this guild review into 2 sections, the creatures section and the non-creatures section, where I go through all of the different creatures that you can use to do basically everything that a non-creature spell could do. The only real exception to that is removal, which you will want to have, but I'll cover that after I cover the creatures. First up, we are going to cover the good blockers of the set. You really do need these in order to not get run over by more aggressive strategies, so that your better late game can often take over. These cards are some of the stereotypical decent good blockers. Pass Wall Adept, just a 1/3, pretty it can shut down 2 2s, it can shut down 2 1s really well. 1 1s just pretty decent, especially on turn 2, and then it has a relatively good ability in the late game, just letting you chip through when you can activate it twice in the same turn, get in for 5 damage. Dimir Informant is really premium. Surveil 2 can help you hit extra lands, or if you're a bit flooded, it can help you find the gas you need to get to the late game. 1/4 is a pretty big body. It can block pretty much every other 3-drop, and every 2-drop as well. Thoughtbound Phantom is really great because it's both a defensive creature and a win condition, because a lot of the time, Dimir is going to have a decent amount of surveil, I'm not exactly sure, surveil, and it can just come down early and be a decent blocker, and a 2/2 body is relevant at a lot of points in the game. Even if you draw it later, it can be a decent double blocker and then threaten to grow. Child of Night is kind of going to be format dependent. It depends on how many 1/1s are running around. But I have the it's at least going to be a good sideboard card, because if you're playing against an aggressive deck and they trade their 2/2 for your Child of Night and you end up 2 life in the exchange, then it's just a huge swing. So Child of Night is quite good. And if it gets in a couple of hits unopposed, it can also get you that extra life. And then Hired Poisoner is pretty strong card. Just Death Touch on a 1-drop is just means it's going to trade for anything pretty much. There are some first strike creatures which could be a bit annoying, but overall, Hired Poisoner is going to be quite nice, I think. especially because even later in the game, it's still relevant as a blocker against their 5/5s and their 6/6s and things of that nature. Some traps that are blockers. I just briefly wanted to mention these. Barrier of Bones and Wall of Mist strike me as the type of card that a lot of people are going to play. They're going to be like, wow, my deck has a great late game. I'm going to just want to survive until that. And so they'll try to play these walls, these defenders that can't attack, that have no power. And Barrier of Bones even surveils. They're like, wow, all this upside. So the reason this type of card is bad is because, at least in my opinion, and I know I'm not alone in this opinion, the reason these types of cards are bad is because there's several reasons. First of all, the fact that they have 0 power means that your opponent can attack through them. So even if these were like 1/5s or 1/3s, it means that if your opponent has a 2/1 and a 2/2, they can't attack you and get in for damage because the 2/1 will just die and they'll just lose their guy, really. So if they have no power, so your opponent can just all-out attack you if these are your only blockers, and they can get in for some points of damage around the wall. Another reason they're bad is because sometimes you're playing against other Dimir decks. So you're playing against other slow controlling decks, maybe not even Dimir, maybe Golgari, maybe a Selesnya deck that's a bit slower, Izzet decks that are a bit slower, even a Boros deck that has a better late game because of some bomb rares or something. But essentially, you play a Wall of Mist against some decks, and they're basically, to that deck, it doesn't do anything because they're planning on winning with a big flyer, or they're planning on winning with other things, and Wall of Mist is just a complete blank. Whereas even those other creatures, the ones that have power, can at least attack them and put a little bit of pressure on them to like do something. But Wall of Mist is just a complete blank in those matchups, and same with Barrier of Bones. So I really think that these cards are ones you want to avoid, but I do think people will play, especially Barrier of Bones, a little bit too much in the early stage of the format. It is a fine sideboard card, so if you don't quite get there on the better blockers, you can maybe side in a Barrier of Bones against certain decks. Like if you're playing against Boros and your deck only has like 4 2-drops and you really want another early play, you can side these in. But overall, you really don't want to play them, especially in the main deck, because a lot of the time they will be dead cards in the matchup. Okie doke. Next up, we are going to cover the creatures that can give you card advantage. Starting off with a very basic one, Muse Drake, 4 mana, you get a 1/3 body and you draw a card. So you get a creature plus a card. That's card advantage. The creature's not huge, but it is a flyer, so it can chip through for some damage. 1/3s can block a lot of things. There's several like 1/3 type cards in Dimir, so they can like really combine well on double blocks and stuff. So I think Muse Drake is going to be pretty solid. You don't want too many of them because they can get clunky in your hand. The body's not that big, but I think a couple of them could be fine, especially because they do put you up a card. Night Veil Sprite is one that when I first read it, I was like, oh my goodness, what is this card? It's so good. Because when you realize that it has flying, I mean, it's not card advantage per se, but the fact that you surveil one every time it connects, which is pretty often because it is a cheap evasive creature, so it's hard to block early in the game. If you can surveil one every turn, it's just such a huge advantage. That's basically like drawing extra cards. I'm not sure the exact conversion ratio, but it's very, very strong. And it is a card that you will want to prioritize, and it's good in any blue deck. It's just such a good card. House Guildmage is kind of like card advantage because of its activated ability that lets you surveil 2 for 3 mana. I mean, at a certain point, when you don't need extra lands, you're just getting rid of those cards, so it's like drawing cards at that point. And also, if you need lands, you can get rid of expensive spells. So this type of effect is just really strong and gives you a little bit of virtual card advantage because it increases the card quality of your draws. Darkblade Ancient, if you have enough surveil, it deals damage and can draw you extra cards. Pretty nice effect, especially if you have some instant speed surveil things, because then they might like, it's a 2/3, so it's kind of hard to single block in the early game. Like there are definitely creatures that can do it, but sometimes they'll just have a couple 2/2s because they played a couple 2-drops, and if they double block it, then you can like surveil at instant speed with something maybe. And then Burglar Rat is a card that I love. I think that even though it's only a 1/1, making them discard when it enters the battlefield is just super effective, and it's gonna limit it'll make them sometimes make tough choices if they have to get rid of a strong card or keep the land that they need, things of that nature. And just Burglar Rat's going to be quite solid. It is just straight up card advantage. They discard a card, you like have a creature on the battlefield. It may not be the biggest creature, but it is a creature, so it's the type of card that you're going to be very happy to play. It's also a 2-drop. It's not the greatest blocker, so I don't think it's like, I think you still need to have a good mix of like good blockers and creatures like Burglar Rat, but Burglar Rat's definitely a nice card. Next up, we have Win Conditions. Going to be, like, most of these creatures share a common trend. City Watch Sphinx is a huge flyer. You can win the game with that. Watcher in the Mist is a common that's a huge flyer and also surveils too. I think that card's going to be very premium. You're going to play, like, basically, like, 3 or 4 of them, probably like 3 of them pretty happily, just because it makes it, like, so easy to not flood out after you get to 5 mana. It's also a huge flyer, pretty decent blocker, but like really good at closing games out. Dimir Spybug is a really nice one. It is pretty cheap, but that doesn't mean it's still not like a great early play because it takes some time to get going. But if you play this on like turn 4 alongside another 2-drop, or play it on turn 5 with a 3-drop, and then you start surveilling and getting those extra counters on it, can win the game on its own. Nightveiled Predator is pretty disgusting, just flying, death touch, hexproof. Like, I don't know why they needed to be a hexproof flyer that's like really hard to interact with. I mean, you play this and like not only can it like trade with any of their creatures if they have a good creature, but it's also just like a great attacker. They can't really interact with it, so they have to have flyers, and some color combinations just don't have access to flyers, so Nightveiled Predator is just going to be an excellent win con against them. And then the last card I included on this page is Dowser of Lights. I don't think it's the greatest win con, don't get me wrong. It's not a great card even. But what I wanted to emphasize is that when you have a good Dimir deck, it really doesn't matter what you win with a lot of the time, because they have no cards and you have like 3 or 4 cards in hand, and you've just completely dominated the game to the point where you can just play a 4-5 and win. Whereas even if you've got the game firmly under your control, you don't want to just let them keep drawing cards to maybe draw their bomb rare. You do want to have something that can put some pressure on them, and a 4-5 is a pretty big body, so keep that in mind if you don't have a win con and your deck is pretty good. Other than that you may just want to run a Dowser of Lights or really any big creature. But what about the non-creatures, you say? I mean, these creatures have been pretty nice, but there are a ton of good non-creature spells. Mainly, they're going to fall in the 2 categories of removal and card advantage. Removal just is the real reason you want non-creature spells. As you can see from the creatures we've seen, you can get a lot of card advantage inherently from your creatures that you don't necessarily need to have dedicated non-creatures that are for card advantage, though they are nice to have if your deck can slow the game down enough that you can afford to cast them, because a lot of the time, I mean, it's really nice to cast a dedicated draw 2 spell and just like be able to win with that type of thing. Removal is also a really nice one. It's basically a category that doesn't get covered by creatures, so you do need to find a way to play your removal spells. So here we are going to go through the removal spells first. Capture Sphere, blue gets a removal spell this time around. It's pretty nice. I mean, 4-mana removal spell at instant speed is pretty effective. It doesn't remove it from the battlefield entirely, so if it's got an activated ability that doesn't require mana, I mean, that doesn't require tapping, it could still be like annoying, but most of the time Capture Sphere is just going to be a removal spell. Dead Weight is a really nice one. Dead Weight gets even better if you can't always get like cheap blockers, because it can kill the cheap plays they have really efficiently, or even just shrink things down can like basically kill them. Artful Takedown is really nice because you can cast it like on their pre-combat step, tap down one of their creatures, kill the biggest creature you can with it, and then just save yourself a lot of damage with that. So I think Artful Takedown is going to be quite good as well. Deadly Visit is just the de facto big removal spell for black at common. Destroy a creature, surveil 2. Doesn't get much more simple than that. Very good card. You'll play several copies of these if you can. It's just really nice. It's like 5-mana removal is quite clunky, but it is still quite effective. Like, it's still something you want access to a lot of the time in a Dimir deck, just to make sure that if the game goes long, which you hope it does, you don't lose to your opponent's strong cards, because they have a higher likelihood of drawing them as the game goes longer, which makes sense. And like Deadweight can't necessarily take care of a huge flyer. Like if they have a 5/5 flyer or something like that, then Deadweight shrinks it but doesn't kill it. So like you want to make sure you can kill stuff. And then Price of Fame is just, it's an uncommon 4-mana instant speed, destroy target creature. Very similar to Artful Takedown. I mean, a lot of the time they can kill the same thing. Same with Capture Sphere. I think Price of Fame is like good, but like not like insane. There's not all that many legendary creatures that you need to be killing, and by the time they're casting their scary legendary creature, you probably have 4 mana anyway. It's just a good card though. Surveil 2 is quite nice, so Price of Fame is definitely a premium pickup for your decks. With removal spells, you really can, like, in theory, never have enough removal. I mean, in theory, there's a point where you can have too much removal, but you're never going to get there because people prioritize removal because it's much scarcer than creatures. So take removal highly and play pretty much everyone you get on that front. Now we're going to go through some of the other interactive spells. Spoiler alert, most of them are not that great. Devious Cover-Up, 4-mana counter spells just aren't great. I don't think you should ever play this. Disdainful Stroke is more of a sideboard card, I think, if you know your opponent has expensive cards. It does work pretty well against Convoke, because Convoke means that they're going to be playing some expensive creatures in that deck, even though they don't necessarily go to the late game. So Disdainful Stroke can be a nice piece of tech against some of the Convoke creatures, but a lot of the time it's more of a sideboard card for if they have an unbeatable bomb, or something, you don't really necessarily want it in the main deck, because you have to keep in mind that the time that the Dimir deck is weak is in the early game, before a lot of its card advantage kicks in, before the game is like stabled so it can cast card draw, before it can deploy its huge flyers. So Disdainful Stroke doesn't necessarily, it's a counterspell that doesn't help you with the early game, which is a lot of what you want to help. Thought Erasure is a card that I don't think is going to be good. I think it's too slow in limited. You can get anything with it pretty much. But if you spend like 2 mana on this and your opponent is just curving out on you, casting creatures, sure, maybe you snag one of their better creatures, but they'll still have like 5 power in play before you even play your first creature, and that's really a recipe for disaster. Mephilic Vapors is one that I think has potential. It is sorcery speed, so keep that in mind, that you can't like use it as a combat trick. But depending on how the format shakes out, it could be a really good sideboard card against certain decks. It's really hard to tell how good like deal 1 damage to everything is going to be before the format like has developed and you see how the cards interact with each other. But it definitely has potential, so keep that in mind. Like if your opponent plays like 3 creatures that have 1 toughness, or like some token makers or things like that, Mephilic Vapors could definitely be a good sideboard tech. I don't think it's great in the main deck because it doesn't do a lot against some decks. But so it does Surveil too, so it's not like the worst inclusion, but I just don't think it's great. Never Happened is really way too expensive to be playable. You can sometimes in sealed, especially, like you would side this in if they have like an unbeatable bomb, but you don't usually ever main deck this or even side it in limited. Some other interactive spells. Dazzling Lights is not really what this deck is about. It's much better as a it's hard to get as much value out of this as you think. Like it seems like it'd be great, but if you have creatures in play and your opponent's still attacking you, a lot of the time the combat trick's not the greatest. Also, combat tricks on defense aren't as good, and the Dimir deck is oftentimes on defense. So like you won't necessarily have the mana to hold up a Dazzling Lights. You're going to have to tap out to play your creatures. So I don't think Dazzling Lights is insane. I think it's playable in certain decks, especially if you can be more assertive and if you have some Surveil synergies. But I think Dazzling Lights is like a very marginal card. It just doesn't do a ton. Sinister Sabotage is medium, I think. I don't think it's great because it's basically cancel with a little bit of upside. And while the Surveil one is nice, I just don't think that 3 mana counter a spell is going to be that great. I think that you can sometimes have like 1 Sinister Sabotage in your main deck and be like fine with that, especially if your deck can start to control the game like really early, like if you have a lot of good blockers. But the problem with Sinister Sabotage is if you fall behind, you can't afford to hold up mana, and then your opponent plays their big creature anyway. So just be aware of that, and mostly keep it. It's fine in like control mirrors in the sideboard. It's going to be pretty good, I think, but mostly it's not going to be a great main deck card. Discovery Dispersal is a pretty cool one. I think you're mostly going to want to use the Dispersal half, and it's tricky to use, so I don't think it's like insane, but I think the main idea, this type of card is cool when your opponent is like empty-handed and you can bounce their creature and make them discard it, so in that way it's like 5 mana removal, but like it's just really flexible, so I don't think it's insane. Like I don't think you have to like first pick this, or that it's like unbelievable, especially because Discovery is pretty bad. Like Surveil 2 draw card is like not great for 2 mana, but I think it's a fine card. I think it's a card that you'll be happy to play. Like you'll probably play several copies of it. It is very flexible after all, so it's just a really tricky one to evaluate. Vicious Rumors I think is quite bad. Essentially you're paying a mana and discarding a card, because I mean you're losing Vicious Rumors to make your opponent discard a card. So essentially you have to think like, is the 1 damage I'm getting worth the card that I'm wasting, pretty much? And because you're both down a card at the end of the day, and I don't think it is. I think Vicious Rumors is unplayable, especially because later in the game your opponent's top decking and they don't have any cards in hand. Unexplained Disappearance is like a nice piece of interaction, but it's a little bit harder to use in Dimir because bounce spells are inherently better in more aggressive decks, because you can oftentimes like use it to get rid of a blocker and kill them then. But I do think Unexplained Disappearance is going to be a like card that you don't mind playing like 1 copy of in a Dimir deck. You can still oftentimes get some value out of it, bouncing a creature when they use a combat trick or something of that nature. Maybe even bouncing your own creature if it has an aura on it or something like that. And the Surveil is a nice bonus because there are some Surveil synergies. So I don't think Unexplained Disappearance is bad in Dimir, but I think it's probably just better in Izzet decks. But I still think it's a nice card to have access to, because it is very cheap interaction, and from the removal page, only Deadweight is cheap, so a lot of the removal you're going to be wanting to, like, a lot of the time you won't be able to interact for any cheaper than Unexplained Disappearance, so it is a fine card. I I think it's like a medium level pick. Like you'll be happy to have one copy in your deck, in my opinion, but you don't really need to go overboard. And if you don't have one, it's not the end of the world. You can use creatures. These are just some removal spells that I thought were traps. Severed Strands is really not what this deck is about because you don't really want to be playing. There aren't a lot of creatures that you're gaining value from them dying in blue-black. So you're just 2 for 1-ing yourself to kill something. Granted, it is cheap, but you are sacrificing a creature to do that. So it's not as good as any of the other removal spells. So I don't think you should be playing the card. Necrotic Wound is a card that looks like it would be good because you are surveilling a lot of creatures into your graveyard, presumably. But Necrotic Wound is good when the Dimir deck is already good and bad when the Dimir deck is already bad. So I think it's a card that you want to avoid for this deck because you already have a lot of ways to kill creatures in blue-black, and Necrotic Wound doesn't do anything in the early game when you need the most help as this archetype. So I think that Necrotic Wound is better left on the sidelines or for other decks. Though there are some decks that will want it and play like a copy. But keep in mind, it's not really active until the late game. For card advantage, we have only 3 spells that I could find that are like direct card advantage, like you draw cards or you draw a card, they discard. Chemist's Insight is going to be a great one. Draw 2 cards and then Jumpstart is like basically, it's like a 4-mana draw 2 and then 4-mana draw 2, discard 1. But it's overall going to be very good, especially because you can surveil it into the graveyard early and then still get that advantage. So I think Chemist's Insight is going to be a card you want to take early and play, like build around a little bit. Like, if you have it, it's a really good card advantage engine. Disinformation Campaign is really, like, pretty great. It's like you play it, and you draw a card, and they discard a card, and then you play you do anything that surveils, and they immediately, like, it comes back to your hand, which is just insane. So, I think Disinformation Campaign is going to be one of the better Dimir cards. If you have a copy of this in your deck, you're just going to shred them in the Control Mirror, because you're just going to be constantly making them, because there's a lot of surveil, especially incidental surveil, and you're just going to be constantly drawing extra cards and making them discard cards. So if it works the way I think it does, which, I mean, maybe I'm misreading the card, but like, it looks like every time it just comes back to your hand, which is just going to be great. So I think Disinformation Campaign is definitely an early pick and a card that makes you want to prioritize surveil a little bit higher. And then Notion Rain is basically Read the Bones, but better because it has surveil instead of scry. So it's only a Dimir card, but it's like really nice, and I think that the Dimir decks are going to be happy to run 1 copy of this, maybe even 2 if they can afford the pure card advantage card, because I mean, surveil 2, draw 2 cards is just going to be really nice, but it's not great if you're getting beaten down because you're not developing the board at all. Okie doke. So here are just some baselines. Now that we've covered the creatures, the non-creatures, here are some baselines for what you want to be playing. I think you need 5 to 7 early plays. I did the math on a hypergeometric calculator, and if you have 6 early plays on the play, that means you'll be seeing 8 cards before turn 2. You have about a 70% chance of having one, which is, it obviously goes up if you're on the draw, and it goes up if you have 7. So I think 5 to 7 is like the range that you want, so you have a pretty decent chance of having a turn 2 play, so you don't get run over by another deck. That's obviously the weakness of Dimir, because Dimir, as you can see, has those like great pure card advantage cards. It has pretty good creatures that come with card advantage. It's got good flyers to win the game, and it even has some like, it has really good removal for the later stages of the game at the 4 or 5 mana spot, but the early stages are where you can really get run over and lose. You also need to have 3 to 5 win conditions. Even if you do have like great controlling plays, you need to make sure that you can win the game in the end, because a lot of the time you can like stabilize the game and then your opponent top decks their burn spell because you haven't been able to kill them. So you want to make sure that you prioritize picking up some win conditions. So 3 to 5 is the range I would recommend. If you have more than 5, then you probably like have too many, to be quite honest, because you're going to be able to filter through your deck a lot to find them with surveil. It's really nice if you can find cheap cards that are also win conditions, so that's why Dimir Spybug's pretty nice, because it's a cheap card that you can play a little bit earlier, block in a real pinch, and it just wins you the game later on. So you really want to prioritize cards that can be a win condition, so you don't just stall out the opponent and then lose because of them having like 1 burn spell, or like something of that nature, or 1 bomb rare that you can't beat. You want to ideally have like as many removal spells as you can, so 3+ removal spells. If you don't have 3 removal spells, you're going to be in a weaker spot, and then you have to like really be selective with what you use your removal spells on, because you don't have that many. But there are a ton of removal spells at the common level in black and even blue. I mean, there's only the one in blue one, the Capture Sphere, but I think that you're going to be able to get 3 removal spells in most of your drafts, and obviously there is a like theoretical cap. Like maybe if you had the choice between your 8th removal spell and a good creature, you'd take the creature just so you can actually kill your opponent. But you're never really going to get to that point. So just take all the removal spells you can get as long as they're good removal spells. And then finally, you're going to want to have 0 to 3 pure card advantage engines like the 3 we mentioned, the ones that are just draw cards. The draw card, they discard a card, and then the scry 2, draw 2. You don't want to have too many of those effects. They also get, because like if you draw like a hand that has 2 of them against an aggressive deck, you're going to lose because you're going to be drawing cards and they're going to be killing you. They're also really good out of the sideboard. If you're playing in a control mirror and you just bring in like 3 extra scry 2, surveil 2, draw 2s, you're just going to win the control mirror a lot easier. And have a pretty big edge. So yeah, those are the baselines. You just fill the rest of the deck with card advantage creatures, maybe a bounce spell, maybe, yeah, mostly just utility creatures at that point, and basically whatever like odds and ends you want. But these are like the type of things that when you're building a deck, these are like the check boxes you want to hit. Do I have early plays? Do I have win conditions? Do I have removal? Do I have some card advantage built into my deck? Because that's how you're going to win as a Dimir player. Finally, these are just some tips and tricks. Save your removal spells. A lot of the time, you can get away with just using your blockers, your creatures to be removal, be like virtual removal by just taking it out of combat. So you really want to save your removal for if they have a bomb rare or something you can't beat otherwise. Second tip is be selectively aggressive. So what I mean by this is if your opponent, if you think you've won the game pretty much, like they have no more resources in hand, but you're like at a slightly lower life total. Maybe you're at 6 life or 7 life, and your opponent has shown you that they have like burn that can target your face. Maybe like that's the time when you have to like start attacking your opponent. Maybe they have a bomb rare you don't know about. But if you like just sit there and like attack them for 1 every turn, so maybe they'll have some outs to draw to. So once you've turned the corner and your opponent has like nothing going on, definitely start to attack them a little bit more. Don't be like, well, maybe he has this exact card, because you do have to finish them off before they draw. Maybe they can string together several cards in a row to beat you. Whereas if you killed them earlier, then it would they wouldn't be able to have those extra draw steps. So once you've locked the game up, make sure that you're not being like stupidly aggressive, like you're not attacking too much, but selectively aggressive, attacking enough to kill the opponent while still protecting yourself. And then final 2 things are sideboarding is key. I mean, if you're a slow deck like this and you're playing against another slow deck, you can take out some of those cards that are just good in the defensive, that are good against aggressive decks, and take those out for more of your big top end finishers, like more bomb, like more big creatures, more card advantage, the cards that you wouldn't want in an aggressive deck but you definitely want. But definitely make sure that you can side those out. And on the other side, like if you have a couple of the surveil 2, draw 2s, lose 2 life, and you have like say 2 of those in your deck, maybe take 1 out against the aggressive deck. Maybe bring in another 2/1 lifelink or Child of Night, something like that. And then finally, I don't think this is going to happen all the time, but I can definitely see this happening as people decking themselves as a Dimir deck. They're like surveilling, they're like looking at their cards, they're like, especially on Magic Online where you can't like see the size of your deck slowly getting smaller. They're like surveil 2, surveil 2, surveil 2. Yeah, I don't want these lands, and then they just deck themselves when they really had no excuse and they should have just won the game. But don't deck yourself, don't be that guy. I'm sure that someone's going to have it happen to them. But yeah, that is going to do it for my Dimir guide. I really do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to click that thumbs up and consider subscribing to get updates for whenever I post new content, including future installments of my Guilds of Ravnica guild guides. But yeah, if you have any questions about specific cards or how to play the deck, the archetype, be sure to let me know in the comments section down below, and I will gladly respond with my thoughts or answers. If you have any other feedback, I would love to hear it as well. It really is nice hearing from you folks and getting your feedback, and yeah, I really do appreciate it. But yeah, that is going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.